You can be right. You can be right about Jesus and still try to correct him. Think about that for a minute. You can be right about who Jesus is, yet still try to get in there and correct him. You know, most people, they don't mind admiring Jesus, but the crisis comes when Jesus refuses to be the Savior or the Lord that we would prefer. Therefore, we can be right about Jesus and still try to correct him. Well, that's the disciple Peter. He rightly declared who Jesus was, and the Scripture tells us that he began to rebuke Jesus. Think about that. Here's the disciple Peter rebuking the Son of God. Well, this morning we want to confront that impulse and correct our vision, as it were. We want to look at Jesus with clear sight that sometimes results even in a greater cost. You see, Jesus does not merely ask for admiration. He summons us, and he summons our allegiance as our King. And that allegiance comes in the form of a cross. This morning we begin a new series of sermons called The Crown, a King and His Kingdom. And over these next 4 weeks, we're going to walk with Jesus. We'll hear Peter confess Jesus as the Christ. We'll watch Jesus redefine kingship through suffering and service. We'll see Jesus enter Jerusalem as the promised king. We'll see Jesus stand before the empty tomb as the crucified king, now alive and victorious. But the series will follow the movement and flow of Mark's gospel. And this journey will take us from confession to cross, from coronation to commission. And Mark is going to show us that Jesus is not merely a teacher or a miracle worker to admire or to impress us, but that he is king, yet a king like no other. He wears a crown, but it's made of thorns, not gold. He ushers in a kingdom, but in a way that people don't expect and some people just don't like. He does conquer, but he does so through sacrifice. He reigns, but not with the strength of armies, but through a cross and an empty tomb. So this is the story of a crown reached through the cross. And it's the story of the kingdom of God and what it looks like for us to be a part of that kingdom, living under the reign and rule of Jesus Christ. And it's a kingdom that calls for surrender. It calls for faith and service and bold living as a disciple of Jesus. Well, at the heart of this series lies this central tension. And that's this, that everybody wants a crown, but few want the cross. That's one of the big reasons why this sermon series matters, is that, many people are comfortable with a Jesus that inspires and comforts and helps, but yet the Gospels confront us with a king who also commands and calls us to die to ourselves. So Jesus does not ask only for our admiration. He calls for our allegiance. He does not merely invite us to appreciate his kingdom from a distance. He calls us to enter it and do it on his terms. So as we move through this series over these next few weeks, we're going to trace that story of what this true king looks like and what it looks like for us to step into that kingdom. So today we want to get a vision check on how we are seeing Jesus. We want to kind of put a biblical eye chart on the wall today to check our vision. And as we do, we will learn that seeing Jesus clearly means following him sacrificially. So if you've ever wanted Jesus just to fit your plans or Jesus to fit your agenda, then you are standing at the exact spot of the disciples were. So today we pick up in Mark chapter 8 in verse 27. There we read these words. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Christ." And Jesus strictly charged them to tell no one about him. So when we put this biblical eye chart up on the wall, we see clearly who Jesus is. You know, last fall I purchased new glasses with a new prescription lens in them. And it's one of those things where you don't know how bad your eyes are until you get the new lenses. When I first put them on, it was a whoa moment. I was like, I can actually read the fine print on my Bible now, and things are actually clear, and things look sharper. And then you kick yourself going, why did I wait so long? Well, Peter, I think, had one of those whoa moments on that journey to Caesarea Philippi. A moment when he sees Jesus clearly for who he is. So Jesus and his disciples, they're traveling. They're taking a walk, and this discussion comes up. And Mark names the place for us. It's a setting called Caesarea Philippi. And that setting is important because geography matters in this discussion. Caesarea Philippi is a place that's away from the center of things. If you look up on the map there, it's way to the north in the area of Israel, 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. It's really almost in Gentile territory. It's about as far from Jerusalem as you can get and still be in Israel. So Peter's confession of who Jesus is, it doesn't happen around the center thing of Jerusalem. It's out on the fringe, out in the margins. But it's also important to know that that region of Caesarea Philippi, it is saturated with pagan power, pagan worship, and Roman imperial branding. All around that region was cult worship. It was a pagan outpost. They would worship different pagan gods there. And then later they would worship Caesar there. Herod the Great built a temple there honoring the Roman emperor. Herod Philip expanded it and renamed it in honor of Caesar. That's where the name comes, Caesarea Philippi. So the city is claiming and shouting that Caesar is Lord and that the pagan gods rule. So this city is like a billboard for Roman pagan power. So it's there, in that setting and in that region of cult shrines and false gods, that Jesus poses this question: who do people say that I am? And the disciples, they report kind of the religious Gallup poll of the day. They share what the common understanding of Jesus is, that people think it's John the Baptist. Some people say it's Elijah, the prophets, who Jewish people believed would return. And other people just say, well, he must be a prophet of some kind. But then I love what Jesus does next. He presses it further beyond public opinion to personal allegiance. And he turns the corner with this question. He says, but who do you say I am? And then Peter has this incredible confession of this revelation of who Jesus really is. He says, you are the Christ. In other words, you are the true God. And this confession is just a direct challenge to all the pagan gods around them that day. And I think Mark's gospel here wants us to feel this shift that's taken place from Caesar's city, Caesarea Philippi, to true power in the form of a cross. It's important for us to know that the word Christ is not the last name of Jesus. It's a title. It's a messianic title. It's the Greek form of the Hebrew word Messiah. So both Christ and Messiah mean the anointed one. So Peter here is confessing, he's declaring that Jesus is the promised king that Israel had long been waiting for. So Peter recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. His confession is accurate. He gets the identity correct, but he gets the mission wrong. And here where we see is that his understanding of what the Messiah is to do is incomplete. He doesn't understand what kind of Messiah Jesus is to be. And he'll soon find out that Jesus did not fit any type of mold that Peter had. So this is really like a hinge point of Mark's gospel. They get the title right, but the next verses reveal that they just don't grasp what Jesus came to do. But you see, it's possible to be right about Jesus and still try to correct him. We may say Jesus is king, but we think of him as a different king from what the Gospels show us. And today I think we live in a world that loves to categorize or compartmentalize Jesus. You know, we have Jesus as the moral teacher or moral guide that keeps our culture from melting down. Or we have Jesus, the inspirational guide and life coach, and we put his quotes up on the wall and we just get a quick pick-me-up of Jesus in the morning before we head out. Or we have Jesus, the advocate, striving for societal change. Or we have the age-appropriate Jesus where we just let Jesus stay in the children's wing of the church. Let him teach our children only and not really impact our adult life. As much as we want to categorize Jesus or put him in a box like that, Jesus will not settle for a category. What he does call for is confession. Confession that comes from allegiance for all of our life. So Jesus asks each of us today, who do you say I am? See, admiration alone is not the lifestyle of a disciple. Using the right words or saying the right things about Jesus is not the same as clear sight of Jesus. And just like Peter, we can confess him as Christ and still resist him when following him gets costly. So we need to ask ourselves this morning, is our confession of Christ producing surrender, or is it just producing biblical sounding vocabulary? You see, Jesus gets to define what it means to be a disciple. It's on his terms. Well, from this point on, Mark shifts the question from who is Jesus to the question of what kind of Messiah is he. And then in a moment after that, he gets even more personal, and we'll look at what does it look like to follow him. We pick back up in chapter 8, beginning in verse 31. And Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And after 3 days, rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." See, when we put that biblical eye chart up on the wall, we see clearly who Jesus is, but then we also see clearly what Jesus came to do. So, like I said, immediately after Peter's confession, Jesus just begins to explain very plainly, very clearly what kind of Messiah he is. He doesn't conceal what he's about to do. He just lays out the sequence of what's going to happen to him in the days ahead. Suffering, rejection, death, and resurrection. And he wants the disciples to know that what's going to happen to him is not an unfortunate detour. It's God's divine plan. The Messiah's mission has always been and will be running through this suffering and resurrection on the way to victory. So I love how it just tells us that Jesus said this plainly. No more parables, no more ambiguity. Jesus just says, here's who I am and what I'm about. And the issue that the disciples had is that they didn't like the route that Jesus was about to take. And this is where I think this text really gets interesting. Because at this point, Peter decides to coach Jesus a little bit. You know, he pulls him aside and he wants to offer a few points of correction. And I can imagine the conversation going something like, yeah, Jesus, that's really great and all, but if you could just do a little bit of this. If you could, like, overthrow Rome. If you could create an uprising, you know, a coup over the Roman government, that would be really great. So Peter moves from this confessor of who Jesus is to a corrector of Jesus' mission. Again, he doesn't deny his identity. He gets that right. But he definitely rejects the agenda that Jesus has. So here we see Peter being right about Jesus and still trying to correct him. Now, but before you say, well, I would never do that, I would never be like Peter, there's a word of caution here, I think, for all of us. Because one of the most subtle forms of misunderstanding or even unbelief is any attempt to improve Jesus' plan. You know, in other words, we want the life to the fullest that Jesus talks about, but we leave off the death to self stuff that he also talks about. So Jesus publicly rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Well, those three words, "get behind me," I think they have the flavor of discipleship to it. Because Peter, he's out of place. He's out of step. He's trying to step in front of and direct Jesus. But the place of a disciple is behind Jesus, following him. We stay behind him. The disciple doesn't steer. Our place is never in front of Jesus, editing his mission or setting the agenda or leading the way. It's always behind Jesus, where we learn to follow him. So Peter, I believe, is thinking in terms of worldly power and success and victory and human expectation. And he wants that crown, but without the suffering, without the cross. But Jesus was clear that is the crown through the cross. But I think that day it was a theological gut punch to Peter, and it can be for us as well. Because Jesus says the Son of Man must suffer. It was a divine necessity. It was not an accident. It's not tragic. It's not a miscalculation. It's not political bad luck. It was God's ordained plan from the beginning. And if we rob that word "must" of its force, then we really empty the gospel of the cross and the glory of Jesus. So the cross was not a takeaway for the mission of Jesus. It was the mission. You see, God saved the world through his crucified Son. And because this crucified Christ rose victorious, he is now our saving King, and he calls us for allegiance to him. So where might you be trying to correct Jesus in your life? When Jesus doesn't fit your agenda, do we try to step in and correct him? When obedience costs us comfort, do we try to step away or step in front of Jesus? When faithfulness risks reputation, or when truth-telling becomes really hard, or when generosity threatens our sense of self-control, do we want to coach our way back into self-centered living? Well, at this point, things get really personal. Again, Jesus drives it home as we continue looking at our text today. Picking back up in verse 34. And Jesus, he called the crowd to him with the disciples, and he said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? And what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. With the biblical eye chart up on the wall, we see clearly who Jesus is. We see clearly what he came to do. And lastly, we see clearly what he calls us to. And simply put, he calls us to follow him sacrificially. Jesus expands his calling from his immediate disciples to everyone when it says, if anyone would come after me. And in my study this week, I looked up that word anyone, and it means anyone. If anyone would follow Jesus, and then he gives three commands that really frame the lifestyle, the life of a disciple. Let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. To deny ourselves doesn't necessarily mean denying possessions, but denying self as ruler. So it's renouncing self-rule, it's renouncing self-assertion or self-promotion, self-agendas, self-ambitions. It's giving up that right to self-determination. It's putting aside the idol of I and allowing Jesus to take control. And then Jesus says to take up our cross, and that might be one of the most misunderstood phrases in this passage. That's not about just a general inconvenience. Crosses are not merely hardships. But what this is referring to is the cross is something that specifically comes from following Christ and embracing the way of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus. Jesus is saying that to follow him, it could be costly. So deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow me. As I mentioned earlier, that's where we stay behind Jesus and he is out front. He determines a path, he determines our pace and our pattern for life. And then we get one of the greatest paradoxes of being a disciple of Jesus, and that's basically losers are keepers. Because whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake in the gospel will save it. But what I think that means is that you could win every argument in life. You could do everything you can to get your ideas to be the ones that are accepted and convince everybody around you that your ideas are best. You could position yourself continually above other people. You could strive to get ahead and still lose your life. In fact, Jesus tells us you will every time. The journey, clear sight of Jesus is not just the right vocabulary on Sunday. Clear sight is demonstrated when we follow him sacrificially every day. Now, many people don't refuse Jesus outright. We just tend to negotiate, don't we? We negotiate our way out of a lifestyle of being a disciple. So we say, Jesus, I'll follow you if you do this. Or I'll follow you, Jesus, as long as it doesn't cost me that thing or that habit. Jesus, I believe in you as long as it doesn't disrupt my lifestyle choice. Or Jesus, I'll confess you as long as I don't have to carry anything heavy like a cross. Journey following Jesus involves 3 deaths. Death to self-centered living, death to a safe life, and death to self-serving life. So what does it mean to see Jesus clearly? Not in theory, but in practice. Well, as I wrap up today, I want to come back to those 3 commands of deny, take up, and follow. This week, you can practice denying yourself by looking at your heart and identifying one area in your life where you have an I insist attitude, where I want my own way attitude, and surrender that to Jesus. It might be a spending pattern that you keep justifying. It might be a habit that you keep excusing as not that bad. It might be a grievance that you keep feeding and pouring gasoline on. And simply pray, Jesus, I'm stepping off the throne and I'm giving that over to you. Deny yourself. And take up your cross. Step into something faithful that Jesus is calling you to, even if it will cost you, even if you've never done it before, even if it's scary. Choose integrity where compromise might benefit you in the short term. Give even when it's inconvenient, and embrace generosity. Serve in a hidden way that goes unnoticed, that's outside the spotlight. So take up your cross. And thirdly, follow him openly. I mean, give a clear confession of who Jesus is in your life. Name Jesus where normally you might remain silent. So that might look like just asking somebody if you could pray for them. Or as you're wrestling through a decision, just verbally say, hey, I'm trying to follow Jesus in this decision. Or it might be, the boldness of inviting someone to come to our Easter services. Inviting someone to read the Gospel of Mark with you. Inviting someone to be a part of your life group. Seeing Jesus clearly is following him sacrificially. I'm going to invite the praise team back up this morning. This passage that we've looked at has this flow to it of right confession to right understanding, and right understanding to right obedience, which is Jesus-style living. See, Mark wants to help us see clearly who Jesus is, what he came to do, and I think really what it comes down to is how we follow him. So Jesus asks, who am I? And Jesus explains what he does, and then he reveals how we are to live. How we are to live our life by denying ourselves, taking up that cross, and following him. So this morning, Journey, you can respond to Jesus with a confession, like Peter, and say, Lord, you are the Christ. That might be a first-time profession of faith, or it might be a renewed commitment to Jesus. You can respond to Jesus with surrender and say, not my will, but yours be done, and stop trying to correct Jesus and get behind him. You can respond with obedience and say, hey, I'm going to deny myself and take up my cross and follow even when it's hard. So here's the question to keep in front of you this week. Will you keep Jesus as an admired leader, or will you follow him as your crucified king? Who do you say Jesus is? Let's stand together and worship.